This tale has been brought to you by the Prehistoric Times magazine and Time Safari's Walking Tours Rockhampton. If you love prehistory, make sure you grab a copy of the world's longest running dinosaur magazine, the Prehistoric Times. And why not join me in one of my fossil tours of Rockhampton Zoo or the Botanic Gardens? You'll get to hold some real fossils and we'll talk about some of the crazy prehistory, both animals and plants, of the central Queensland region. Links below. With the release of the film Oppenheimer, it's time to set a few facts straight. While that American scientist most certainly led the Manhattan Project team that built the bomb, there was one man who actually initiated the entire process, and that man was the Australian physicist Sir Mark Oliphant. We begin today's tale in 1943. In the future, geologist Reg Sprigg would unearth the world's oldest complex fossils, and trust me, we will be revisiting Reg in the future. But for this story, all we need to know is Sprigg was desperate to join the war, like so many young Australians, and he found himself recruited into the Royal Australian Engineers. This led to him being sent all over Australia, exploring rocks and landscapes for various reasons. In 1942, Sprigg was ordered to participate in a, quote, mission to Tasmania as a humble soil surveyor and assistant research officer in the Soils Department of CSIR, the early version of the CSIRO. Sprigg would then expand that this hush-hush project proved to be soil surveying. Initially, I was told it was in search of land suitable for carrot growing, although at the time, most of the physical emphasis was on the preparations for soldier settlement among swampy coastal sand drifts. Carrots? Why would the war effort spend time specifically looking for land for carrot farming? The British Health Board had begun pushing carrots as a staple food for everyone to grow and start eating simply because the island nation was being starved of resources because of the war. Dozens of food transport ships were being lost to the German Navy and Air Force, and carrots were a very handy thing. They could be used instead of substances like sugar. This was certainly an issue for England, but in Australia, there was plenty of food and sugar was not in short supply. Something else was going on. Here we find a link to a myth that sprang up from the Second World War, a myth that's still prevalent today. Like some modern telemarketing ad campaign, the Australian papers in 1941 were suddenly filled with articles about a superfood with astonishing physical benefits. The 19th of September issue of the Tasmanian Examiner carried an article titled Carrot Planting. The Potato Marketing Board has received the following information from a most reliable source. Regarding carrot planting, I can assure you that army demands for fresh and canned carrots are exceptionally heavy. However, the situation is really a matter of need, and although there is more seed in Tasmania than in any other part of Australia, I feel that you could not overdo the carrot position in Tasmania at the present. This military need for carrots had been spelled out earlier in the year. Melbourne's Argus newspaper reported on the 21st of June, "Why carrots aid night vision." Since it has been discovered that keratin, a component of carrots, aids night vision, and that it is being tested with a view to supplying it to aviators and other members of the fighting forces, it is interesting to find the reason. Vitamin deficiency in food quickly causes health deterioration, a discovery that has led to the diagnosis and cure of some maladies which had baffled medical science. Early in the 18th century, it was recognised that some benefit apart from food value was derived from green vegetables. But the discovery of vitamins in 1914 set investigation off on a new field of research. Vitamin A, which is present in green vegetables, egg yolk, cod liver oil, milk, and is necessary for the growth and the health of young animals in particular. And what was the article about? Keratin obtained from carrots. Experimentally, it was found that young rats deprived of this vitamin ceased to grow and developed a disease of the eye. But the disease cleared up and growth again became active when a complete diet containing vitamin A was restored to them. There appears to be bottled sunlight in this vitamin. Newspapers across the Western world were soon carrying the news that if you ate carrots, they'll improve your eyesight. This idea became so invasive on the public psyche, it's still passed on to kids today. During the war, there were propaganda posters recounting the need for everyone to eat and grow carrots. Even Disney got in the act, with a cartoon carrot family crowing about the importance of carrots to the war effort to the British public. Let's get this straight right now. Keratin and carrots do as much for your eyesight as any other healthy food source. In fact, the entire carrot eyesight link was a ruse to hide a new technology. And this explains why Sprigg was left curious why his secret mission had suddenly become so public in the world's newspapers. The answer was simple. England had a great need to hide the truth behind the RAF's sudden ability to shoot down the Luftwaffe, especially at night. Of course, this new weapon wasn't carrots. It was radar that had been placed in the RAF's fighters that were shooting down enemy planes at night. And this technology had been designed and placed there by an Australian scientist, Mark Oliphant. Desperate to try and bluff the Germans who'd surely noticed the sudden improvement in British fighter pilot accuracy at night, something was needed to explain away their successes. And so a legend began to grow that the Royal Air Force had hit on the idea that it was their pilot's special diet of carrots that was now helping them win the war. This was nothing more than propaganda. Certainly, carrots are helpful in keeping you healthy, and this includes helping your eyes, but it does nothing to improve eyesight. It was the RAF reporting that carrots were helping their pilots with their eyesight, but it was all a ruse. It was radar. Years later, Sprigg would later recall the truth and why his secret mission had been leaked. Quite early on in the piece, I learned the reason for the publicly leaked need for expanded carrot growing. Air pilots required them, we were told, to improve visual acuity on night bombing missions over Europe. Carotene is converted to vitamin D, important in the production of visual purple for improved night vision. All very simple, and I believed it all. Sprigg also recounted how he discovered this truth after a meeting he had with none other than Oliphant. Many years later, the real story came out via friend Sir Mark Oliphant. Britain was secretly developing radar and had to explain away the greatly improved night bombing accuracy somehow. Our job in ignorance was to put the enemy off the scent. Apparently, it was hoped that the news of our mission would be leaked via the large Italian prisoner of war camp community in Tasmania and filtered back to the enemy in Europe. And I have to say, apparently, this never worked. Not only had Germany already seen through this myth, they'd captured a British plane with radar on board, so they already knew the truth. Now, radar was not the only thing Mark Oliphant had to do with the war. So let's hear from the man himself from an old interview.
My name is Mark Oliphant. I was born in a Kent town near Adelaide in 1901. I went on from high school to the University of Adelaide. Unfortunately, I was unable to pay my way there, and so I had to take a job as a cadet in the physics department in the university. However, I was lucky in having a very good teacher in physics in Adelaide, a man named Burden, Dr. Roy Burden, who started me off with enthusiasm on this subject and who weaned me away, I think, from my ideas of being a chemist or a doctor, and taught me that the extraordinary exhilaration there was of even minor discovery in the field of physics.
So born in Adelaide, Oliphant graduated from the University of Adelaide in 1922, then headed over to England to complete his degree at Cambridge after winning a student grant.
I won an 1851 overseas exhibition, which enabled me to go to Cambridge to study with Lord Rutherford in the famous Cavendish Laboratory. This scholarship was founded by the husband of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, with the monies that were accumulated as a result of the 1851 exhibition, the first great exhibition, you remember, held in London in the Crystal Palace.
Here we have yet another paleontology link. The Crystal Palace exhibition is where the world's first life-size dinosaurs were put on display. So the money that this exhibition made went to grants for students to go to university, and this was won by Mark Oliphant, whose work would later create the bomb. Paleontology is all over this story. It's amazing. Joining the Cavendish Laboratory, the Australian arrived at the perfect time as the scientists there were about to take this institution into one of the most successful periods in the history of physics.
After 2 years in the Cavendish Laboratory, I obtained the degree of Doctor of Philosophy from Trinity College and was able to get some more money as a result of getting some further scholarships from the Royal Society to help me to carry on with my work. I went to Cambridge with a very clear idea of the sort of research work that I wanted to do, and Rutherford was very kind in allowing me to carry on with this, because it was not exactly the sort of work which he himself was interested in. Then in 1932, following the discovery by Cockcroft and Walton in the Cavendish Laboratory of the artificial transformation of chemical elements, one into another, Rutherford invited me to work personally with him in order to extend this type of observation.
Here Oliphant completed one of the first experiments to artificially change the nucleus of one element into another. The physicists also discovered a new particle during this, the neutron, and followed this up by then confirming the presence of the positron.
My original work had been associated with the properties of positive ions, that's to say of atoms of matter which are charged positively with electricity. And this was useful in that for the research work that I was to do with Rutherford, we needed intense beams of positive ions of hydrogen which could be accelerated and made to hit targets of various kinds. In this work, which we did together, we were able to discover two new kinds of atomic species. One was hydrogen of mass 3, unknown until that time, and the other helium of mass 3, also unknown. These new atoms were produced as a result of atomic transformations induced by our ion beam hitting targets of lithium, beryllium, and other materials.
It was during these experiments that Oliphant learned how some particles reacted to each other and released far more energy than they started with.
Incidentally, at the same time, we were able to show that heavy hydrogen nuclei, as to say the cores of heavy hydrogen atoms, could be made to react with one another to produce a good deal of energy and new kinds of atom. This particular reaction, which we discovered at this time, is the basic reaction used in the so-called hydrogen bomb. Of course, we had no idea whatever that this would one day be applied to make hydrogen bombs. Our curiosity was just curiosity about the structure of the nucleus of the atom. And the discovery of these reactions was purely, as the Americans would put it, coincidental.
Coincidental? Oliphant and his team had just created the first ever demonstration of nuclear fusion. And he further speculated this sort of reaction is what powered the sun. Later, this information was applied to the creation of the hydrogen bomb. I feel this point needs repeating. It was an Australian who first demonstrated the process to create nuclear weapons. This was not coincidental. This was the proof atomic power was possible, and Oliphant's participation in creating the bomb had only just begun. Now, before we go on, I should point out it was during these experiments that Oliphant also discovered tritium, a radioactive isotope that today is used to create nuclear energy and weapons. Though the Australian recognised tritium, he could not separate it from its host helium. This was later done by another physicist, one famous in the world of paleontology. Luis Walter Alvarez was not only the man who managed to isolate tritium. In 1965, he went on to do lots of things. By using cosmic radiation, proved there was no hidden chambers under Cairo's pyramid of Sefren, the second largest pyramid. He'd also become really fascinated with the Abraham Zapruder film that captured the assassination of the US President John F. Kennedy. And by studying this film, he proved that by the way the president's head snapped back, it consisted with him being shot from behind, but he also detected a shock wave that affected the film and light and helped prove there were 3 bullets fired. But this is not what Alvarez is famous for. In 1980, he introduced a new theory that is still argued today. All over the world, at rocks around 66 million years old, there is often a very small clay layer. And within that, there is a very rare element called iridium. Iridium is only found at the Earth's core and occasionally comes out during volcanoes, but mostly it's found when you have a meteorite impact. This was the first time that the theory of an asteroid impacting on the Earth caused the cataclysmic extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. But back to Oliphant. While completing his PhD at Cambridge, Oliphant was headhunted by the University of Birmingham, which was looking to create a world-class physics department. A fully equipped laboratory sounded like heaven to the Australian, who had been forced to often purchase his own equipment at Cambridge.
To my surprise, I found the Cavendish Laboratory to be a poky building in a little back street called Free School Lane, and the Cavendish Laboratory in those days was extremely poor, so that we had to make do with coffee tins and sealing wax, with bits of paraffin wax, and with all sorts of odds and ends in order to carry out our experiments. There was no luxury about it whatsoever.
It was here that he would start to produce equipment that would help win the war. England had already begun investigating and installing radar stations across the island. These often required enormous towers along the coast, and these became very obvious targets to the Luftwaffe, who may not have known exactly what the towers were for, but had a pretty good idea they meant trouble.
In 1937, I was invited to become appointing professor of physics in the University of Birmingham and head of the physics department there. War began to loom in Europe, and some of us were asked to spend some time at the coastal defence stations around Britain, learning what radar was all about and to endeavour to do what we could to improve it. When war broke out, I was invited by the Admiralty to take charge of a team working in my laboratory to develop radar working at very much shorter wavelengths, with a wavelength of only a few centimetres. We were rather successful in this, and were able to produce devices which could be flown in aircraft for detecting other enemy aircraft, which could be installed in ships for detecting other ships and submarines, and which from aircraft could even detect cities on the ground. These radar developments, which were described by Vannevar Bush in his book about the American war effort as the greatest single item in reverse lease land, we were rather proud of. But by the year 1943, we came to the conclusion that we had done all we could in the development of radar, and returned once again to the nuclear work, which was our real home, as it were.
Now, Oliphant was extremely good at taking very complex, large technology and creating a much smaller version of it, which is how he developed radar into a smaller machine that could fit on a plane. First, he built the Klystron, which was built on the back of this existing technology, and helped the Allies keep ahead of similar systems that Germany was developing. The cavity magnetron was developed by a second team, and this was designed to use much shorter waves. This system required less power, so could be developed into a smaller machine, allowing it to be installed on planes and help seek out enemy targets at night or on the ocean. This immediately blunted both Germany's night bombing attacks on the UK and its highly successful U-boat strategy to starve England into submission by sinking all of its supply ships. Always outgunned, and with most of Europe falling under Nazi control, England would manage to survive this time thanks to Oliphant and his team, pushing this technology as far as they could and help the Royal Air Force defeat the German Luftwaffe. This technology also had an added benefit thanks to its use of shorter, or another way of saying it, microwaves. This technology would later be adapted into an item most of us have sitting in our kitchens. It was during this time that the Australian joined the British scientific committee called MAUD, M-A-U-D. They were tasked with looking into the feasibility of using nuclear fusion to not only create a, quote, uranium energy machine, but also take this technology and make a practical atomic bomb.
Immediately before the war, there had been discovered in Germany a process known as nuclear fission. It was discovered by an old colleague of Rutherford's, Otto Hahn, and we were immensely interested in this process of fission as a possible source not only of energy, but also as a possible high explosive. In order to exploit this possibility, it was necessary to separate the isotopes of uranium. That's to say, the two kinds of uranium which exist in ordinary uranium and which cannot be separated by chemical methods, because they're both uranium and both have identically the same chemical properties. And it was necessary, therefore, to devise physical means for separating these atoms just because they possessed slightly different mass, one being 235 times as heavy as hydrogen and the other 238 times as heavy as hydrogen. We decided to pursue the possibilities of separating them by forming beams of uranium ions and accelerating these, passing them through a magnetic field where the ions of different mass would describe circles of slightly different radius and consequently could be collected separately at the other side of the magnet.
Some in Maud believe they could probably do this by 1943. Again, thanks to the presence of a certain Australian. Now, it's at this time that Oliphant hired two German refugee scientists. Now, excuse me if I don't say these words right, but Rudolf Pirials and Otto Frisch had been deemed unfit to work on the radar program due to its high security. But they were just what the physicists needed for this new technology. This team soon worked out not only could uranium be used to fuel an explosion, instead of the tons of material most others believed were needed, the group figured what was required was mere kilograms of material. And more was to come. When efforts to create an English bomb began to falter, Oliphant sent all of his work to a similar project in the United States. After some time, when he'd heard nothing from his American counterparts, the Australian jumped in an unheated bomber and, under the ruse of talking about radar, flew across the Atlantic to find out why they apparently had no interest in developing a similar bomb. Oliphant later recounted when he arrived in America that his, quote, reports had been sent to Lyon & Briggs, who was the director of the Uranium Committee, and we were puzzled to receive virtually no comment. I called on Briggs in Washington, only to find out that this inarticulate and unimpressive man had put the reports in his safe and had not shown them to members of his committee. I was amazed and distressed.
While in America in 1941 on radar business, I had had discussions with American scientists about the possibility of nuclear energy. They were not terribly interested at that time, but interest developed, so much so that their project for doing this, which became known as the Manhattan Project, was established, and all communication with Great Britain and America on these subjects was then cut off.
Oliphant here is being rather humble. When the Australian physicist finally met his American counterparts, he talked about nothing but the bomb. He was also supposed to tell the Americans about radar, but instead it was bomb this and bomb that and bomb, bomb, bomb. As every other Western nation was hemorrhaging money thanks to the war, the US was the only nation left with the resources to complete this project. Once he began talking, Oliphant found many of his American colleagues were shocked at what the British had already accomplished. They realised they needed to get behind the idea, and they began talking to the Australian physicist in earnest. It's often cited a letter written by Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard and signed by Albert Einstein, known as the Einstein-Szilard letter, had warned of the possibility of German physicists building the bomb first, and this led to the Manhattan Project. But at the time, this was all based on purely theoretical hypotheses of what the Germans were up to and what was possible. Mark Oliphant, a scientist from South Australia, had just made the bomb an absolute reality and had not so much initiated the Manhattan Project as focused it.
However, in 1943, soon after we started work again on these problems in Birmingham, Roosevelt and Churchill decided that it was absurd to carry on with such a project in both countries, and that it was more sensible to transfer the whole effort to America. So in September 1943, we moved our work to America. I leading a team of British scientists who worked in Berkeley, California, and at Oak Ridge in Tennessee on the electromagnetic separation of the isotopes of uranium.
Oliphant was head of the British contingent working on the bomb with the Manhattan Project. And this is the part that's often ignored. The atom bomb was not a US endeavour, but an international one. Scientists from across Europe, many refugees from states now under Nazi control, as well as scientists from the US, were working on the weapon. And this was an atomic fire ignited by an Australian physicist. In the US, Oliphant was soon joined by fellow Australian physicists Harry Massey and Eric Burhop, as well as two Kiwis, Robin Williams and George Page. This international project got to work, and though Germany was soon out of the atomic arms race after their defeat and surrendering, the efforts of the Manhattan Project continued, and they soon had produced two different devices. Due to their physical shapes, the bombs were nicknamed Thin Man and Fat Man, after two famous movie characters by Dashiell Hammett. The Thin Man was named after the Thin Man film series starring William Powell and Myrna Loy, and the larger device, Fat Man, after the robust character of Caspar Gutman, played by Sidney Greenstreet in The Maltese Falcon. However, the Thin Man was designed to be fired from a cannon, so another bomb was created from the same design to be dropped from a plane, and this device was named Little Boy. And in case you think I've overplayed Oliphant's importance to the history of the bomb, along with a few others, it was Oliphant who created the fissile component. That is, he created the actual material placed inside the Little Boy atomic bomb.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
On the 6th of August, 1945, Little Boy was dropped from the US bomber Enola Gay on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Later, the very same author of the Einstein-Szilard letter, Leo Szilard, wrote, "If Congress knew the true history of the atomic energy project, I have no doubt that it would create a special medal to be given to meddling foreigners for distinguished services, and that Dr. Oliphant would be the first to receive one." And what did Oliphant think of the weapon he'd helped create? Years later, he would recount.
Well, there was a feeling of utter frustration in that the message hadn't got across, that it had been used and used against civilian cities, and that all the moral scruples had been thrown aside by a so-called Christian nation, not by the Japanese or by infidels of any kind, but by a Christian nation, or nations, because England was behind America in all this. And a feeling at the same time that, well, perhaps we were wrong, perhaps this ends the war.
So you had to try and reconcile two things that you needed to do during the war. One was to defeat the Nazi regime, and the other was the great repugnance you had for anything that involved
That's right.
the death of other people.
Yes.
How successful were you in reconciling the two? How did you manage during that time, inside yourself?
Well, I don't know. You've got to develop a double personality, you know, and think one way one moment and then another way the next. You never do reconcile the two.
Oliphant would later recount the day the first atomic weapon was dropped on Hiroshima, and how he was sort of proud that one's gadget had worked, and absolutely appalled at what it had done to human beings.
There was greatly awakened interest in Great Britain after the war in the development of British science, so that it proved possible to get the amount of money required to build a machine of the sort which we had developed. But in 1950, I was invited to come to Canberra to become the first director of the Research School of Physical Sciences. I pulled my roots up in Great Britain in order to start in Canberra with a hole in the ground and lots of promises. It was felt by the founders of the Australian National University that such a body could contribute greatly to retaining in Australia some of the scientific talent which up till then had been going abroad. I believe that it has been successful to some extent in this aim.
It's his effect on Australian science here that cannot be underestimated.
Shortly after my arrival in Australia, I became aware of the fact that Australian science was disjointed and did not enjoy the unity that British or American science had, primarily because there was no body in Australia which was representative generally of science in Australia. Subsequently, some of us who were Fellows of the Royal Society and who had therefore been chosen, as it were, by an outside authority, got together and decided to found an Australian Academy of Science. It was to be a body consisting of scientists who'd been chosen by merit to become fellows and who would be able to assist in formulating scientific policy for the country as a whole.
Once Oliphant had retired from reshaping the world and Australia, he was invited by the South Australian Premier, Don Dunstan, to become the Governor of South Australia. And this was a position he held from 1971 to 1976. Later, he would assist in creating the Australian Democrats political party, before finally returning to Canberra, where he died in the year 2000. Now, there's quite a lot of resources about Oliphant, and in one interview by Robin Hughes for the Australian Biography Project in 1992, the scientist was asked, "If you had your time over again, would you be a nuclear physicist?" His answer, no. What would you have done? I don't know. I think if I was starting out today, I think I'd either be an astronomer or a biophysicist. And I've always kept a deep interest in biological things, expressed nowadays in my feelings that we've got to try and preserve some of the natural ecology of this wonderful country. The whole of the natural fauna and flora of this country are rapidly disappearing. We're losing something like 300 species of plants every year, and an even greater number of insects, and the order of 40 or 50 different kinds of animals and birds. They just become extinct as a result of our activities.
It is one of the intriguing tasks of science to try to find out what exists in the universe, and in particular, whether there are sentient beings anywhere else with whom we can communicate and with whom we can exchange experience.
The man who had helped us tap into the fires that helped forge the universe wanted to look into the origins of life. And in his friendship with Reg Sprigg, he had met the man who pretty much helped unearth this story. He would later recount their meeting in 1947 at Mount Paintier, as Oliphant had been exploring the desert and found himself isolated and alone until he happened to bump into a fellow explorer. I was both exhausted and dehydrated. Offered beer in the shed, I shook my head, unable to speak, and pointed to a large canvas water bag hanging on the branch of a tree. A young geologist in khaki working clothes took pity on me, found glasses in the shed, and led me to the water bag, where I drank more than I'd ever drunk before or since. My saviour was Reg Sprigg. Many of the world's physicists were helping to develop the bomb, and what they quickly realised what they needed was uranium, in quality, sustainable and secure, and was hoped such a supply could be found in South Australia. And once again, step in Reg Sprigg, who in 1944 had joined the Geological Survey of South Australia, and Sprigg later revealed the results of his survey in this video.
Bill, here I'm going to show something very few people ever see. In fact, it's like taking you back for a step in history. Well, Bill, you're actually looking into the very hole that you might say ushered Australia into the atomic age, because this is where the South Australian government was first asked by the Joint British and American US Atomic Energy Commissions to try and develop these previously known uranium deposits for a very special purpose, which we weren't told about, of course, at that time.
You and Sir Mark Oliphant, too, I think, were involved in this?
Well, I'd been brought out of the Army into CSR for special projects and then to the South Australian Government Geological Survey to help open this up. And, of course, Sir Mark Oliphant was one of the team working in the Manhattan Project.
This was Manhattan Project?
That's right, yes. We didn't know the full significance, naturally, at the time, and it came as quite a surprise. We knew it was something very special, something in a great urgency. Of course, it was rather frightening yet exciting to realise it was part of the major atom bomb project.
This was leading towards Hiroshima?
Well, that's sad to say, that was happening.
Well, is there any uranium left in there?
Oh, yes, there's plenty. Do you want to see what happens when you put a Geiger Muller? You watch the thing, it just goes off scale. This green mineral here is the secondary uranium mineral, torbanite, and of course it sends the Geiger mad. Only when you cut it back to an extremely high scale does it go down a bit.
Well, if Project Manhattan was a secret project, how much, if anything, were you told about it?
Well, we were told very little at all, except it was leaked to us in Adelaide that it was going to be used for making atomic suns. Now, we made our own intelligent guesses. We thought of secret rays being made from the radiation that's going on. But I don't think any of us quite realised the enormous power that was going to be locked in bombs.
Well, the bomb that fell on Hiroshima, they say, was brighter than 1,000 suns. Was any of this uranium in that?
No, this is the story that's gone around. None of this ever was ready for processing for that project.
Now, I've just got to say, am I the only one watching this footage that was mentally screaming, "Get out of that damn hole, you idiots!" Now, before we go on, I just want to point out something that's often overlooked at this point was, how did the Australian government know about the need for uranium? Remember, the Manhattan Project was under the strictest security measures, and yet there was Sprigg out there looking for uranium. Turns out Australia was kept informed of the developments concerning the bomb by Oliphant himself, who throughout the process kept contact with Australia, giving them information what was happening, and throughout the entire process, Oliphant always stressed that Australia should secure its uranium deposits. So Mark Oliphant's work not only helped create the atomic age, but also refined radar to the point it could be placed on planes and help defeat the Luftwaffe, and also led to microwave ovens. He also later returned to Australia and at the ANU helped create the Australian Academy of Sciences and helped establish not only future institutes but placed Australian science firmly on the world map. And as for Reg Sprigg, well, I'm leaving him for my next video. I hope you enjoyed that story and I hope you go through and watch some of my other videos. And please like and subscribe, really does help. And why not grab a book? I've got so many on my website, including my latest, A History of the Science Fiction Horror Franchise, The Thing, published by Marcosi Publishing. And once again, all links below. And I'll talk to you during our next story.